Um, you use a phrase, and I'd like for you to give a definition for it. Then I have a question behind it.
Sure.
Hmm, excuse me. Disrupted industries. What is that?
Disrupted industries. So, the you may have come across a word called VUCA. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's essentially kind of the four descriptive words for the modern world that we live in. It's very volatile, it's very uncertain, very complex, and very ambiguous. And what we see in certain industries is those levels of VUCA are significantly amplified. Why? Because the business model or the organizational framework that they have or the structure that they operate in is potentially either outdated or not fit for current purpose. So let's look at a couple of examples. The banking industry would have been a perfect example of an industry that's going through a disruption in the last few years. So not only were banks traditionally a brick and mortar institution, you had a bank on the high street, and that was where all the transactions were done. And then gradually computers came into effect, so those banks became networked. And then all of a sudden it was online banking and telephone banking, and now it's a bank in your pocket. And then the next evolution is the non-traditional financial institutions. So things like Revolut and Wise, who offer almost the same services as a bank without any of the brick and mortar facilities that the traditional banking platforms and organizations have. And so all of a sudden, you've got these basically replica banks without any of the cost base the banking organizations have. And so the banks have then got to go, well, we've got all of these places that we own or rent, all of these premises. We've got to think differently because our business model is not sustainable compared to these smaller, agile organizations. We need to start thinking differently about how we lead and run our organization. So that is an industry that's facing significant disruption right now. Another one would be something like the construction industry, which is previously been, we've essentially built stuff in pretty much the same way. Houses have been built in pretty much the same way for over 100 years. And all of a sudden, we've got people can design their house on their own computer. There's 3D printing. There's new architectural models. There's new materials available. There's new technologies available. And people are trying to prefabricate houses in factories and drop them in. There's an amazing company called Boxable, where you can buy literally a sort of flat packed house that they deliver on the back of a truck, and then they unfold it on the concrete pad, and it's ready in 3 hours. Well, most people take a year to build a house, right? So if you can suddenly build a house in 3 hours, that's disrupting the industry. So again, these traditional construction organizations that have relied on a steady stream of business have now gone, we need to think differently. And in order to think differently, we need to act differently, and we need different leaders to help us. And that's the type of organizations that we get stuck into.
Okay. Well, it seems like to me, when you talk about VUCA and disrupted industries, we're talking about every industry these days. I mean, software development, everything is that way. So I think this is an important lesson. How do we get that chain, that trust, the connection, and the purpose? How do we train that into that type of industry? I know you said it's 70-20-10 split, but when you take your product inside to train with somebody, I think they used to call it the Kirkpatrick model of training, where you want to make sure 6 months from now they're better than what they were this month instead of just that 1 or 2 days. How do I, as a leader, that's the better way I want to put it, how do I, as a leader, make sure that mission, that purpose that I'm bringing forth is trained throughout my disrupted industry?
Yeah, good question. I would always recommend starting with trust. When we work inside organizations, we always start with trust building activities. And we have a 7-point framework that we use to help leaders build trust, because trust for most people is quite a nebulous concept. You do trust somebody, or you don't trust somebody, but you don't really know why, and you don't really know what to do to build trust with people. So what we've created is a framework that allows people to essentially categorize and quantify their levels of trust in their team. So there's 4 different layers of trust, from the most superficial level of trust, which is you work here and I work here, therefore we've got to trust each other this much. Down the next layer would be we work on the same things, we're aligned. So we have to make sure we talk to each other and share some stuff, and I have to trust you that much. And they're very cerebral levels of trust, right? It's like intellectually, I can trust you. What's much deeper is when we move down to layers 3 and 4, which are what I would call the intuitive or emotional levels of trust. So we move into the third layer, which is where we start talking about sort of problem solving together. We co-create, we share potentially mistakes or issues, and then down to the deepest levels of trust, which is where I start to actually talk about things like my fears, my worries, my concerns. And what we see in most organizations is there are very few people who have that base level of deep trust. It normally is reserved for your significant other, your family, and maybe your closest friends. So our job in an organization is to move people from the, yeah, we both work here, down to the, hey, I can stick my hand up and say I've had a bit of a problem with this and I need your help. And for you to be willing to help me back. And in order to achieve those depth of trust, and obviously the deeper you go, the darker it can become, or the more risky it can become in that relationship. So we want to give you a framework to do that. So we have a framework called SERVICE, SERVICE, and that's essentially 7 different levers that you can pull to build trust as a leader, or to build trust with your team. So we talk about the concept of building a sense of safety in the team, both psychological and physical safety. We talk about setting clear expectations. We talk about making sure that you are reliable for your team. So you do what you say you're going to do, you achieve what you say you're going to achieve, and you're consistent. We talk about being vulnerable, and there's a beautiful piece of research around the concept of vulnerability. We talk about being inclusive, making sure that your team and you are both very clear. And the final E is empathy. So you've got safety, expectations, reliability, vulnerability, inclusion, clarity, and empathy. And if you can use the methodology that we have to achieve each of those, what we see is gradually the layers of trust deepen, and that high trust environment allows the performance of the team to significantly improve. Once you've got trust starting to form, and trust is like a snowball, it builds up and builds up. But if you destroy it, it's gone. So you've got to keep putting effort into it. Then you start working on connection. And once you've got connection, you can start working on purpose. But it's, I wouldn't say it's like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. It's like you start that ball rolling, and then as soon as that ball is rolling, you start the next ball rolling and start the next ball rolling. So you try and have 3 legs of a stool being created at the same time in the team. So that's what we do as a framework with the organizations we work with.
Good distinction.